Welcome to Augustana College and welcome to the Swenson Center. My name is Dag Blanc. I am the director of the Swenson Swedish Immigration Research Center here at Augustana. And welcome to this year's Fritiof Ander Lecture in Immigration History. As you know, the Fritiof Ander Lecture is presented annually by a prominent scholar in the field of immigration studies. And it is named after Dr. Fritiof Ander, a leading immigration historian of Swedish immigration primarily, who taught history here, was one of the legendary history professors here at Augustana, and he taught here between 1930 and 1968. And if I've done my math correctly, and you may not trust my math entirely, but I think that this is the 25th lecture that we give. So for a quarter of a century, the Ander Lecture has been presented here, and I have been present at all the lectures. I may have the record. I don't know if anyone else has been present at all of the lectures of the Ander Lecture. There might be some in the room close to that. So we are very glad that we have this tradition of inviting someone in the field of immigration studies to talk to us on an interesting topic, and tonight we will have such a lecture. The Swenson Center is, as you all know, a National Archives library and research center for the study of Swedish immigration to North America. And we are located over in Lackman Hall, and we have immense records dealing with all kinds of aspects of Swedish immigration. We invite you all to come and visit us often and use us. Do not abuse us, but use us and use our records that lend themselves very nicely to a further understanding of the history of the Swedes in the United States, but also on a more general level to the issues of migration. In general, migration to the United States and ways in which migrant groups have come and keep coming to this country and in different ways become a part of the United States. So the Swedes, although the immigration of Swedes to the United States is by and large over, although there are some who still move here, but the mass immigration is of course over. But they can serve also as an example of larger migratory processes, if that's a word, and conditions among immigrants in this country. And it is often said that Sweden itself, which is becoming a country where immigration and migration plays an important role, can learn something perhaps from the experiences from the United States, and perhaps in particular from the experiences of the Swedish Americans, who were immigrants then a long time ago. Enough of that, but I'm very pleased to introduce this year's speaker, Dr. Philip J. Anderson, who will be talking to us tonight. Phil Anderson has an education from both the United States and from Europe. He has a BA from Minnesota, a master's in theology from Princeton, and a PhD from Oxford University in Britain, where he focused on the study of English Puritanism. He taught at North Park Seminary, North Park University from 1979 until his retirement last year. So now he is Professor Emeritus. But he has been a leading force in the field of Swedish American history since 1979, when you came to North Park, and has published widely in this field on both Swedish American, and on American history, in particular the religious aspects of the Swedish immigrant experience and religious contacts between Swedes in the United States and Swedes in Sweden, and the intricate, we would today say, transnational patterns of contact, religious contact across the Atlantic. He has served as president of the Swedish American Historical Society since the mid-1980s, and keeps on being president of the Swedish American Historical Society, and you have been on the Swenson Center Advisory Committee since the late 1980s, I should say. And through Phil, the Swenson Center has been been able to cooperate in many interesting ways with, in particular, the Swedish American Historical Society. I would say the two leading organizations today in the United States for the study of Swedish immigration. And the Swedish American Historical Society publishes the journal, the Swedish American Historical Quarterly, where we have the former editors in this room, Byron Nordstrom from Gustavus. A very important publication. Phil himself has written many books and articles on this topic. Let me just give you a sense of some titles here. Swedish American Life in Chicago, Cultural and Urban Aspects of an Immigrant People, 1850 to 1930. Swedes in the Twin Cities, Immigrant Life in Minnesota's Urban Frontier, 2001. Norwegians and Swedes in the United States, Friends and Neighbors, from 2012. And as I said, many articles on Swedish American topics. His most recent publication is in this book, Curiosities Cats, Writers on Research, edited by Bruce Miller, published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press this year. And it's a collection of essays that deals with how you do research these days, in particular given what we talked about at the Swenson Center Advisory Committee meeting this afternoon, the digital revolution and how that has transformed the practice of academics and the way we conduct our work. And your article here, which I recommend to all, is called Pilgrim Voices, Puritans, Immigrants, come on in. Pilgrim Voices, Puritans, Immigrants, and Historical Research. It's a very interesting, reflective piece on how we do our work. For his many contributions to the field of Swedish America, Phil was made commander of the Royal Order of the Polar Star, Kungliga Nordstjärneorden, Riddare av Nordstjärneorden, a medal awarded by the government of Sweden. You received that decoration in the year 2008 with, I presume, a document signed by His Majesty himself, if you can read his signature. On a personal note, Phil is an old friend and a colleague. We have collaborated for many years on both sides of the Atlantic, something which I have appreciated deeply. I have learned very much from Phil, as I know you will do tonight. I'm therefore very pleased to ask him to give this year's and the 25th anniversary lecture, Fritiof Ander Lecture in Immigration History, on the topic of voluntary religion and the Swedish immigrant experience.
Thank you, Doug. I too value the collaboration in so many ways. Some of the book titles that Doug mentioned, there are 5 that we have worked on together. So it's a real pleasure to be invited to give the Ander Lecture this year. I have been present at many of them myself, and glad to be part of this great tradition. I want to thank all of you for being present tonight. This is a good room, I understand, acoustically, but if you can't hear, even if you're not interested in the lecture, give a thumbs up, and I will raise my voice so you can hear. It's also a privilege to have been associated with the Swenson Center and Augustana College for many years, to support in whatever way possible the work of the center, to work with colleagues in the field, and in a very special way through the years, to form some wonderful friendships here at the college. So I thank you for that. Tonight I want to talk about this matter of voluntary religion, and be kind of a title to my lecture that's not what is printed, and that would be something like From Compulsion to Persuasion. It's a very classic essay on the role of voluntary denominations in American life by the historian Sidney Mead from the University of Iowa a number of decades ago, called From Coercion to Persuasion. And I think I prefer the softer, more generous word in thinking about Sweden, and that is a compulsory society, from compulsion to persuasion, which many immigrants experienced even before they made the crossing to North America, because Sweden was in transition as well. Some may have felt that to be coercion. But the fact was, Sweden had been for centuries a compulsory society, especially in the matter of religion. And now the role of persuasion is a Western 19th century phenomenon. And the place of the United States in that story is as old and as deep and as powerful as anything in comparison. In popular Scandinavian immigrant culture, the role of humor has had a prominent place. It's largely an oral tradition, such as Sven and Oli and Lena jokes, stories about lutefisk and wallpaper peeling off the wall, silly songs, the interchangeable jibes of Norwegians and Swedes telling the same joke, but reversing the subject and the object. Many have found their way into print, usually in small books and pamphlets, like George T. Springer's Jump and Jiminy from 1932, that sell in Scandinavian gift shops around the country and perplex visiting Swedes. But given the prominence of religious beliefs and practices, or chosen opposition to them by more liberated immigrants, it is odd, I think, that little of this cultural humor has been addressed more directly in the nature of churchly conflicts. Humor has interested scholars of folklore, in part because one rarely knows the origin of any particular joke. James P. Leary from the University of Wisconsin-Madison is the author of the book, So Oli Says to Lena, Folk Humor of the Upper Midwest. In an essay in our recent book, Norwegians and Swedes in the United States, that began as a conference here at Augustana in 2007, Leary explores the jocular and formal humor directed against one another. Only one of his examples touches on religion, told by a Norwegian. Christ was walking along the road to Galilee. He met all these different people along the way. Finally, he met a man who was weeping. Jesus said, "Why do you weep?" The man told him, "I'm weeping because I'm a Swede." And the Lord sat down and wept with him. Well, many of us here tonight are Swedish, and we recognize that this feeble attempt at a joke, though we could reverse it to great effect, is really about ethnicity and not religion. Yet the religious humor was there in abundance, if you were in the right place through the years to hear the stories. Because churches were places of variety and tension and competition with neighboring ethnic groups and religious preferences. As Leary has written, quote, "Humorous jokes and jibes are not simply cosmic extensions of an old world family feud. Rather, they address decidedly new world experiences and issues situated in culturally diverse contexts." Unquote. They are born of long histories of relationship and common experience, now in a new setting of voluntary freedoms and pluralism born of competition and entrepreneurial leaders. The conflicted movement over time from coercion to persuasion, that's Sidney Mead's language, from established state hegemony and control to voluntarism in all spheres of life, what George Stevenson called a process of choosing to opt out in order to be free to opt in, finds description in this kind of humor. Here's one from Sweden. There was a conventicle taking place in a rural community. Could be the 18th century or 19th century. Men, women, and children, from newborns to the elderly. A man stands on a stool with an open Bible, a colporteur or a preacher, lay preacher. Some are listening intently. Maybe you've seen the artistic depictions of a conventicle. A woman is praying. A man holds his head in his hands. convicted, or perhaps sleeping. There's coffee on the stove. An infant sleeps in her mother's arms. And then a knock, a banging on the door. It's the sheriff, sent by the priest, informed by a whistleblower. There's silent scurrying to hide the Bibles, perhaps Johann Arndt's True Christianity or Luther's Apostles. The songbooks go under the table. Maybe in a radical place, even the bread and the wine, to be replaced quickly by playing cards and tobacco and ample jugs of brandy. Then the door is opened. The sheriff scans the scene before him and finally speaks. Someone reported that there is an illegal conventicle meeting taking place here. But I see that you folks are just good Lutherans. Good night. And now one from Minnesota. One day, Covenant pastor J.G. Sjoquist was walking down the main street in Dassel. He encountered a man unsteady in his gait from over-imbibing at the corner saloon. Sjoquist offered to assist him across the street at the intersection. "No, Pastor Sjoquist," said the man, "I don't need your help. I don't belong to your church. I'm a Lutheran." "Yes," answered Sjoquist, "I can see that." Well, maybe you see the irony in a story like that, because Augustana, mission friends, others were pretty much equally on the same page when it came to issues of temperance. But here's a story where we know its origin. J.G. Sjoquist told lots of stories, usually about himself, but there may be something personal here. Born in 1832, emigrated in 1868. In 1870, he was denied ordination by the Augustana Synod for lack of education. But he had been educated in Sweden, in a missionary training school. He had been a preacher since 1855. So instead, in 1870, the Synod of Northern Illinois, a Lutheran American body, ordains him. He eventually becomes a covenant pastor. Well, what is behind this kind of humor? The first is directed toward the persecution of the freedom of conventicles by the Swedish state church and its long-standing fusion with political leverage. The famous Edict Against Conventicles of 1726, which made such gatherings unlawful. An act not repealed until 1858, to be followed in 1860 by a law relating to dissenting communities. Please note that the Act of Toleration in England was 1689, almost 2 centuries earlier. The second story reflects the tensions that existed between Swedish American denominations in competitive ethnic communities and neighborhoods, where all the churches, by definition, according to the First Amendment of the Constitution, are free churches. I think much of this humor was good-natured. But beneath it, you can hear hinted the reasons for conflict and acrimony. Well, let's pause and think about this larger free church tradition that many Swedish Americans found themselves to be a part of, and also back in Sweden. The topic of voluntary religion in the experience of the Swedish people, as well as the Swedish immigrant in the United States, is far larger than we can attend to this evening. And it's embedded in a richly layered American history, not to mention Swedish history of the 19th century. So we will look first at aspects of the broader history to locate the Swedish story. And it means stepping back a little bit, incorporating insights from the field of church history, which is my own, and its subset, the history of American religion. When the Swedish Baptist professor of church history in the theological faculty of Uppsala University, Gunnar Westin, published in 1954 his path-breaking study of the free churches through the entirety of Christian history, translated and published in English in 1958 as The Free Church Through the Ages, he was in fact at the vanguard of a pioneering era of historiography. In the years following World War II, scholars from a variety of ecclesial traditions began addressing more critically the history of denominations rooted in dissent from established state churches. Among others, these included on both sides of the Atlantic, Ernest Payne, Horton Davies, Franklin Littell, Sidney Meade, Winthrop Hudson, Roland Bainton, J.F. McClear, George Hunston Williams. Mary has no doubt read him. Vestine's study, however, was the first to cast the net widely and embrace this important current of church history lying behind the origins of most denominations, one that spanned almost 2 millennia. Born in 1890, Gunnar Vestine was raised Baptist and received his historical and theological education at Uppsala. His doctoral thesis in 1929 was on the life and work of the British Methodist George Scott, who was the leader of the Swedish renewal movement from 1830 to his pressured exit from Stockholm in 1842. It was then at the University of Minnesota, pioneer of immigration history, George Stevenson, met Vestine while researching his still definitive study, The Religious Aspects of Swedish Immigration, in 1932. Vestine willingly shared his cache of accumulated primary sources, and through the years the two were very good friends and opened many doors of opportunity for each other, including Vestine's research and lecturing tours in the United States. Vestine taught at Uppsala from 1930 until his retirement in 1956, becoming in 1937 the distinguished scholar of the chair, distinguished holder of the chair in church history, the first from the Swedish free churches in the theological faculties of Uppsala or Lund. During his entire tenure, he edited the major journal of church history, Kyrkohistoriskt Årsskrift. He also taught at the Baptist Seminary in Stockholm, Bethel Seminariet, from 1919 to 1960. Author of more than 20 books on church reform and ecumenicity, Nordic and global free church movements, and studies of United States religious history. His first book was 1931. Students of immigration know well of his 1932 publication of 288 letters on the Swedish Church Religious Immigrant Experience, about 50 of which attend to this matter of voluntary religion in a transatlantic way. Vestine, in his preface, acknowledged his clear debt to Augustana College and Seminary, in particular President Gustaf Andrén, librarian Ira Nothstein, and historian O. Fritiof Ander, who had just published his own Illinois doctoral dissertation on T.N. Hesselquist. Vestine's book on the free church tradition was reprinted 3 times during the first few months of its appearance in 1954, and was translated into German in 1956 and English in 1958 by Virgil Olson, Baptist historian at Bethel College in St. Paul. Vestine noted that his comprehensive subject was one long neglected, largely unexplored, and categorically marginalized in the field of church history. He did much to change that. While others, like the Methodist Franklin Littell, referred to as the Dean of Free Church Historians in America, were looking more narrowly at the legacy of 16th century radical reform under the general rubric, the Anabaptists. Vestine took it all in from the early church to present times and stressed, for us, I think, the importance of pietism as a force for renewal that affected the origins and trajectories of so many denominations in European settings, which challenged prevailing authorities at a time of legally enforced hegemony and persecution of dissenting activity and tender consciences. The Free Church through the Ages prepared the way for what may be considered to be the definitive study of the Free Church tradition, Donald Dernbaugh's The Believer's Church, The History and Character of Radical Protestantism, 1968. A member of the Church of the Brethren with strong roots in pietism, Dernbaugh clearly acknowledged his debt to Vestine, noting that his volume was, quote, a careful and dispassionate historical treatment which avoids thematic discussion almost entirely, unquote. referring to it as more of a handbook in 5 broad chronological chapters. Yet the mastery of detail, the depth of research, and the use of sources are very impressive, including a deep and solid grasp of American religious history within which immigrant stories are embedded. How might the voluntary free church or believers' church constituted by a regenerate membership be defined? Dernbaugh is arguably the most useful guide here. He explores 3 theories of origin in historiography. We don't have time for this, but the 3 are a sectarian view, which he thought was basically Vestine's view. And it's kind of natural for Vestine as a Baptist. And that is that you can trace throughout entire church history dissenting movements over and against established authorities. Persecuted, sometimes driven underground, they'll surface from time to time. This is a view that finds a lot of kinship with heretical movements and others who feel the oppression of authorities. The second, Dernbaugh says, is a Puritan view, and that is mainly looking at the 17th century and kind of the English story from the days of Henry VIII and Bloody Mary and Elizabeth on into the civil wars of the 17th century. This is where you, in fact, find the earliest denominations as we know them. Baptist, Presbyterian, Congregationalist, Quaker, and then in time, Methodist, Unitarian, and so forth. The third, the Anabaptist view, which I think clearly most historians see as the place to begin. And that is the 16th century radical reform among Lutherans and Calvinists and others, particularly the Anabaptist movement emerging in the 1520s. Here you hear quite strongly the need for gathered churches, voluntary membership, and more opportunity for lay people. But I think of particular interest to our concerns tonight, Dernbaugh's most concise definition of the free church heritage is ascribed to none other than Martin Luther. In Luther's preface to his 1525 translation and revision of the German Mass from the Latin, Luther first outlined 2 public orders of the church, one in Latin, one in German, and they're inclusive of everybody. But Luther was disappointed because he said most of the people who come to these orders of the church, he says, most of them stand around and gape, hoping to see something new, novelty. Luther then proposed a 3rd order of the church, which captured the intentionality of the conventicle. Closest, he thought, to the New Testament as an ideal. But he wasn't optimistic. Luther didn't think enough people wanted it, or there were enough people fit for it. But within the territorial Protestant churches of the day, there were increasing numbers who did want it. And as a result, they soon felt the persecution as dissenters and nonconformists from new laws that were established. Luther's paragraph on the 3rd order of the church is too long to be quoted here, but its essential characteristics may be summarized as follows. And here we get a kind of definition of the free churches. First, the earnestness of a chosen personal faith and witness. Second, the covenantal nature of voluntary membership of committed Christians. Luther says, quote, they sign their names, unquote. Third, personal and communal growth in study, reflection, conversation, and prayer. Fourth, accountability and practices of mutual discipline. Fifth, acts of benevolence and mission and love to those in need. Sixth, worship that is close to the daily experiences of people and that invites their participation. And seventh, everything is centered simply on the Holy Scriptures and on the teachings of Jesus. Before anything like free churches emerged in Sweden during the 1840s and 50s, there was little history of popular grassroots movements of dissent when compared elsewhere in Europe and Great Britain. It is notable that Vestine published 2 books in 1936, one on John Wycliffe and the movement of Lollardy, which was a 14th century movement in England that was of great importance to the Reformation of the 16th century, And another one on someone I looked at a long time ago, John Dury, who was a 17th century English Puritan committed to ecumenicity and worked tirelessly throughout Europe and Scandinavia in the 1640s. Vestine wrote books about these two movements. Luther's vision in that third order became most embodied by the end of the 17th century in the Pietist movements led by Philip Jakob Spener and August Hermann Francke, and fueled by Enlightenment rationalism and its expansive quest for the liberty of individuals and communities in new social contracts. The German-American philosopher theologian Paul Tillich called Pietism and the Enlightenment concurrent, twin oscillating responses to the perceived dead confessionalism of Protestant orthodoxy, as well as ongoing reactions to each other. As a consequence, by the 19th century, populist leaders and democratic movements flourished throughout the Western world. Ancient primary structures of church and state gave way to a host of secondary interests in emerging voluntary-based communities. The question of who should govern inverted authority and individualized conscience, such that people were emboldened to be initiators rather than imitators of conforming norms. While democratization came later to Sweden, democratic religious principles had been inherent all along in the expressions of classical Hålla, Moravian, and radical pietism, present in Sweden since the 1720s, with their emphases on personal conversion, conventicles, biblical and devotional reading, the praxis pietatis of holy living, missionary activity, and a place for lay leadership, both in the home and in the parish. Many voluntary associations emerged in Sweden at this time, with transatlantic and inter-European cooperation in funding and organization. The Swedish Bible Society was formed in 1815, the Swedish Missionary Society in 1835, the Swedish Temperance Society in 1837, soon followed by a plethora of local and provincial missionary societies, and the large Evangelical National Foundation of 1856 under the umbrella of the Church of Sweden and the creative leadership of Karl Olof Rosenius. The Anglo-American influence and guidance of people like the American Presbyterian Robert Baird can hardly be exaggerated. Democratic forces were coalescing in Sweden, promoted by both a religious and liberal secular press. The Harvard historian Arthur M. Schlesinger Sr. described this in the United States as an era of joiners to causes and new initiatives. And a new type of leader emerged with natural abilities from below and within, where, as Schlesinger said, nobodies became somebodies. This was also true of the awakening in Sweden to a lesser extent, made possible by three intertwined qualities explored by Nathan Hatch, who was president of Wake Forest University, in his important study of the 19th century, The Democratization of American Christianity, in 1989. And the three things he stresses are the triumph of vernacular preaching in an age of communication entrepreneurs. Secondly, the potency of an unregulated and expanding popular press. Alexis de Tocqueville, for example, observed during his visit to the US in the 1930s that only the press, quote, could implant the same thought into 1,000 minds at the same moment, unquote. So think of the religious periodical Pietisten, published in Sweden between 1842 and 1917, widely read in America alongside the astonishingly vast Swedish American press. And thirdly, Hatch speaks about the importance of music, new genres of music created by experience and the publication of songbooks and so forth, promoting all types of religious activity that people can identify with. The United States was the perfect soil for this kind of thing to grow, and immigrants discovered that. In the early 1930s, George Stevenson was more positive than have been later historians of Swedish immigration that religious grievances in the face of compulsory authority, bolstered by reports of religious freedoms in America, were primary push and pull factors in the mass migration. He was on solid ground, however, in believing that a melding of Enlightenment skepticism and the evangelical movement spawned by pietism resulted in the expansion of free church ideas and practices in Sweden. In the middle of the 19th century, Swedes were really interested, for example, in the model of the Scottish Free Church, begun by Thomas Chalmer in the 1830s. Dissenters, wrote Stevenson, quote, brought persecution. Persecution brought indignation. Indignation brought agitation. Agitation brought reforms. And also immigration, unquote. This is a common story of so-called schismatics, dissenters, and nonconformists in European, British, and Scandinavian history from the early modern era. At the time of Swedish immigration to the United States in the 19th century, the US was the arena of the most varied theories and practices of freedom, choice, and entrepreneurial pluralism. For many immigrants, this was at the very heart of America fever. Denominations in American history have collectively been understood to be the primary element in the country's religious life. We could debate whether that is still true today. I think it is. This notion was explored thoroughly in the writings of Sidney Mead, a Methodist and acknowledged doyen of American church historians during the 1950s and 60s. The early and expanding espousal of voluntarism was what he called the triumph of the left-wing influence, especially the fruits of pietism. Independently, Vestine also spoke of the triumph of the free church idea between 1800 and 1950. In contrast to the headiness of some European-derived confessional traditions, Mead emphasized the importance of religious experience. He wrote, quote, "Here was an intimation that the essence of a church was the voluntary association of individuals who had had the experience," unquote. By this he meant things like personal conversion and a formal communal bond in membership. The denomination, unlike traditional forms of the church, he added, quote, "is not primarily confessional, and it certainly is not territorial. Rather, it is purposive," unquote. This was strengthened all the more by the 19th century westward expansion of the frontier, where the greatest growth was among Methodists and Baptists. What Alfred North Whitehead cleverly labeled, quote, "the epoch of American life." In his perceptive essay, The Voluntary Principle in American Religion, James Luther Adams asserted that while many think a definition of voluntarism is merely the freedom of the individual, belief, speech, self-determination, its essential social meaning is in its institutional ingredient, the rule of persuasion instead of coercion. Voluntary associations, he said, bring about innovation or criticism of the society. It distinguishes a democratic society from any other. It separates and breaks up entrenched structures of authority and power. It is more than an attitude, it is action. Fredrika Bremer confided to her sister in 1851 that democratic America could be a model for Sweden because it has, quote, "a warmer heartbeat, a more energetic, strong, and useful life," unquote. Voluntary associations thus present historic turning points, the passing of old eras and the emergence of imagined ones. Swedish immigrants knew and experienced this often confusing liminal transition with one foot in the old world and the other in the new. Yet because of the significant developments of the voluntary principle in Sweden, both religious and secular, many carried it as well in their satchels and trunks as they crossed the Atlantic to new lives. In answer to his own question, what is America? The English writer G.K. Chesterton characterized the United States as, quote, a nation with the soul of a church, unquote. He concluded that America was a home for the homeless, an asylum of all the world, and as a spiritual entity, the nation must include every religion that these diverse people brought along. Therefore, the Swedish immigrant encountered not only more freedom than ever anticipated, but more competitive religiosity, conflicting opinions, beliefs, and practices, all displayed boldly and loudly, it seemed, by everybody. As Tocqueville had observed, in the US, one meets a preacher who sounds like a politician. And then you meet a politician who sounds like a preacher. Some things never change, perhaps. The Swiss-German Philip Schaff commented in the 1840s with more caution that, quote, every religious vagabond is here free to ply his bungling trade, unquote. Well, whether private or public, religion was omnipresent in the culture in a way quite different from the homeland. A place where Mother Church, perhaps we could say a church with the soul of a nation, brooded and fretted over her wayward offspring who chose other paths, or no path at all. Baptists, Methodists, Mission Friend Covenanters, even Eric Jansenists, Mormons, Adventists, and Pentecostals. The voluntary principle instinctively went against the identity of a folk church. But how to be precisely that in Swedish America would be, I think, Augustana's most vexing challenge. The majority of Swedish immigrants did not join churches. Most every ethnic community had all the denominations physically present and in competition with one another. And though by far the largest organization in Swedish America, Augustana never claimed more than a quarter of the new arrivals. In fact, the earliest free churches in Sweden came to be largely because of American influences, which in turn were transplanted back to American soil through immigration. Though Baptist beginnings in the late 1840s were inauspicious, two men in particular provided early leadership through personal experience. F.O. Nilsson, a sailor converted to Methodism in the United States, was rebaptized in Germany in 1847, founded the First Baptist congregation in Sweden, and following his imprisonment, later pardoned by the king, served as a colporteur for the American Seamen's Mission. Theological and ecclesiastical leadership was provided by Anders Wiberg, an ordained Lutheran pastor who worked alongside Scott and Rosenius. He lived in the US from 1852 to 1855, converted and married Carolyn Lindemuth, an American Baptist in Philadelphia, wrote regular reports as a paid correspondent for the Swedish daily Aftonbladet, was employed by the American Baptist Publication Society, translating numerous pamphlets into Swedish, toured the immigrant settlements in the Midwest, and worked tirelessly for religious freedom in Sweden. Equally affected by American influences, early Swedish Methodism began in the United States largely through the Hedstrom brothers. Olaf, a tailor and sailor stranded in New York, converted to Methodism as early as the 1830s, and later returned to New York Harbor, welcoming and assisting immigrants at the Bethel Ship, John Wesley, from 1845 to 1875. His brother Jonas labored as a pastor in Western Illinois, starting several churches. Baptists and Methodists were of most immediate concern to Swedish Lutherans before and after the forming of the Augustana Synod in 1860. George Stevenson believed with good reason that the tensions between the state church and the free churches in Sweden were not nearly as great as those between Augustana and the Swedish American free denominations, Baptists and Methodists, and then more nuanced and confusing relations with Rosenian and Waldenstromian Lutheran mission friends who would establish the Covenant Church in 1885, as well as the more radical free with a smattering of Adventists, Congregationalists, Episcopalians, and Presbyterians. On another more fundamental and protracted front, Augustana had to contend with both older Americanized Lutheran synods and recently arrived Germans and Scandinavians, who in their disestablished freedom of church and state could skirmish and splinter over many things, most often matters of theology and ethnicity. Though equally influenced by Rosenian pietism in the early years, Augustana increasingly sought to maintain and foster continuity with the homeland of Lutheran archbishops and cathedrals, of high Lutheran liturgies and firm Lutheran loyalties. Upon arrival in America during the 1840s, Swedish Lutherans became immersed in a wholly other religious landscape, where in 1775 there had been 1,800 clergy in 23 denominations. But by 1845, when they started to arrive, it swelled to 38,540 preachers in 49 denominations and multiplying rapidly. And it still is. Southern historian Gordon Wood described the early Republic and antebellum era as, quote, the time of greatest religious chaos and originality in American history. The conservative, protectionist circling of the wagons by Augustana in relation to pietistic and revivalist free church-minded compatriots was understandably intensified. It was all too new and unpredictable, beyond the control of traditional polity and theology. Though several critical differences existed and would lead Lutheran mission friends, these are the covenant people who come later, just note that they arrived toward the end of the Civil War, so they're a full generation behind Augustana. In choosing its formal identity, it really had to do with the doctrine and nature of the church. That was most defining, not the theological argument over the atonement, for example, in the 1870s. Augustana, understandably, became opposed to this believers-only model of church membership, though some early congregations, like Olaf Olsson's in Lindsborg, Kansas, adopted it. President Eric Norelius complained in 1878, no doubt in reference to Dwight L. Moody's influence among Swedes that year in both countries, about, quote, a newfangled conversion method insinuating themselves in our churchly life, which echoed the concerns of President T.N. Hasselquist a decade earlier. Quote, some Christians from Sweden, especially among those who call themselves evangelicals, that is, Rosenians, have lately tried to be by themselves, but their experiences should have taught them that no good results from this. In actuality, it was precisely their experiences that emboldened and solidified their convictions. As David Nyball, the first president of North Park, would say in an address to the World Parliaments of Religion at the Chicago Exposition in 1893, these are, quote, convictions too strong to be silenced, unquote. Well, much was said and written in defense of the free church congregational model, for example, by Paul Peter Waldenström in Sweden, much vilified for his views about the nature of the church and the congregation, as he was for his views about the atonement. For Waldenström and other mission friends, and I think the other Swedish and Swedish American free churches would agree with this, the church could never be an institution of the state and remain biblical. The argument would be that it's the very nature of religion itself to be compelled by persuasion and never compelled by rule of law. There was no official endorsement of Christianity until the year 312 AD by the Emperor Constantine. The definition of the communion of the saints in the third article of the Creed was fully affirmed by Waldenström and other mission friends, but they would say it first resides in the local congregation, then extends organically in a universal ecumenical embodiment of all Christians past and present. Waldenström wrote in 1899 that it was inevitable that, quote, the Lutheran Church would cease to be a state church, and as a free church be positioned alongside the other church denominations with the same rights and obligations as these, unquote. 101 years later, that became reality. Mark Safstrom who teaches at the University of Illinois, has been translating fresh Waldenstrom and writing about many of these issues. And the title of Mark's recent University of Washington PhD thesis is, quote, "The Religious Origins of Democratic Pluralism." And Mark's subject is Sweden itself. Early Augustana leaders such as Eric Norelius, pastor, educator, leader, and historian, were clearly aware that the Synod in the United States was technically a free church, like all others, yet committed to the ecclesial patterns rooted in centuries of an officially established church, at least since the Diet of Uppsala in 1593. How then to voice and negotiate fundamental differences of ecclesiology, the folk church versus the believers' church, was not easy. David Nyball, the Covenant's leading immigrant intellectual and son of arguably the most popular and respected quote-unquote free church man in Sweden, Carl Johan Nyball, offered an interesting comparison. Writing in 1929, one cannot know for certain whether or not Nyball was aware of Ernst Troeltsch's sociological distinctions between church, sect, and mystical types in Christian history, as in his Social Teachings of the Christian Church, 1912. Nyball described not so much a separation in kind as he did a dialectical set of emphases between what he called the state church mind and the free church mind. He had Augustana and the covenant foremost in his own mind, and he did not understand the two minds a simple antithesis, or that it is by necessity polarizing. Rather, he wrote, quote, "All friendly relations involve both." I think it's interesting that he talks about the mind, and the mind is not the brain. The mind encompasses experience and is richly nuanced. And we think of some classic books in American history, Perry Miller's 2 volumes on the New England mind, Ellen Heimert's book, Religion and the American Mind, Roderick Nash's book, Wilderness in the American Mind, or John Jarity, who gave this lecture a few years ago, The Minds of the West. I think it's a really interesting concept to see how the mind functions, not as rationality and brain, but in terms of who we are as individuals and communities. Here's what Nyball wrote, and we're getting to the conclusion. There is an essential distinction, this is 1929, between the free church mind and the state church mind in their different emphases on present and future, on individual and common values. The state church mind is more concerned with children than with adults, emphasizing education rather than revivals and sacred usages such as rituals rather than personal habits. The free church mind, on the other hand, emphasizes conversion and the emotional rather than confirmation and the rational. The state church mind, if conservative, looks to the future for the sake of the past. If progressive, looks to the past for the sake of the future. The free church mind lives in the present, in the full and strong pulse of adult experience. This may in either case be advantageous or disadvantageous. The free church people, in their busy bargaining with others, find it inconvenient to pay their debt to their ancestors and their children, while the state church people, who generally pay their debt promptly, may sadly neglect the less formal obligations. This is interestingly seen in a different attitude to what is new and what is old, in a different emphasis of time and place, or rather experience and numbers. It is the nature of the free church mind to applaud the new, for what is the present but perennially new. In the free church mind, there is a strong tendency to listen to strangers, to the visiting preachers, rather than to local pastors, to any voice bringing strange messages, than to the familiar accent of one saying always the same, the usual. In the state church mind, the new is accepted not because it is new, but because it either verifies or nullifies the old. In the free church mind, the accent is on the experience of the one, more often one's own experience, the start, emphasizing beginning and great numbers of others beginning, the first cry of newborn conversion. In the state church mind, both experience and numbers are emphasized differently. There, the emphasis is on the experience of all, rather than on the one, and on experience as a whole, rather than on any one experience. Numbers are counted in succession rather than in bulk, thus making members to the free church mind more or less a scream. In the state church mind, more or less a stream. It's kind of vintage Naival writing in English at the time. No one thought more deeply about covenant identity than David Naival, and his primary concern was for a retention and appreciation of the covenant's Lutheran pietist origins within a free church heritage, in a climate that was increasingly, and for him alarmingly, one of pragmatic, historical revivalism and fundamentalism in the United States. Most members of the sister covenant church in Sweden, founded in 1878, they retained their membership in the Church of Sweden, leading Stevenson to characterize the Mission Friends as the leaven in the lump of the Swedish church in both countries. The two minds for Naival, therefore, ought never be considered simply an either-or, but rather a richly nuanced both-and. It was really a difference of weight. For Covenanters, a correction to the a correct connection to the primordial state church mind was a corrective and a grounding. For Augustana, though rejection of any free church mind had become more or less categorical, in Naival's mind it need not be so, and perhaps originally was more blurred than later thought as trajectories diverged. Dr. Treadway, for example, has shown in his new biography how in what he calls the unique historiography of Conrad Bergendorf, quote, an upbeat historic read of Swedish history, unquote, meant the need to demonstrate an unbroken organic continuity with the Swedish Lutheran folk church and its intellectual and educational life. For Bergendorf, deeply influenced by strands of pietism and the personal apprehension of faith, the pietist to him always remained a divisive problem if loyalty to the Lutheran confessions was not strongly endorsed. Though there appears to be no evidence that Bergendorf and Naival, who died in 1946, ever corresponded, unless Dr. Treadway, you've seen something here, one imagines that they must have met, even conversed. One also wonders about what might have been said and how North Park College's retired president might have replied to the president of Augustana College's comment that the covenant church, quote, was the vine that grew over the Lutheran wall, unquote. Maybe good fences or walls make good neighbors. If only we could know what they may have talked about. Russell Ritchie, a Duke University historian and expert on the ecology of religious pluralism, has written that denominations constitute, quote, a distinctively American contribution to religious taxonomy, a religious form that successfully accommodated traditional religious claims and affirmations to the voluntarism and free association of a free society. This requires close and careful examination. And I'm reminded of artistic renderings of Carolus Linnaeus, the 18th century Uppsala botanist, especially the striking 1980s sculpture at the Chicago Botanic Garden, depicting the father of taxonomy stooped over, magnifying glass in hand, naming and classifying the various species within the genus of the beautiful and richly varied botanical world. Not unlike all the denominations of Swedish America, involuntary, albeit competitive, associations rooted in freedom and conscience in the new land and in their new lives. Thank you.
rich presentation and for this taxonomy. I can see you like Linnaeus with your magnifying glass, isolating the different strands of religious experience here, and emphasizing that fundamental difference of voluntarism contra, not coercion, but
compulsion.
Compulsion. The state church mind versus the free church mind. We have time for questions and comments, and I invite you to address them to Phil, if you have any. I'm sure you do. John.
You mentioned the word entrepreneurial several times in talking about the church in the North American continent and the problems that I'm sure created in creating these new religious roots. Could you speak a little bit about how that involved the financing or developing of these new churches? It must have been a challenge.
Well, yes and no. I think the entrepreneurial is seen more strongly in those movements that came out of revivalism. And here we have the strong Anglo-American influences. The Swedes, you know, they had strong views about Dwight L. Moody for or against, because they knew the power of the Moody revival in Sweden in 1878. But in the United States, especially, the immigrant, if you were an entrepreneurial evangelist type preacher, and you probably saw less of that in the Augustana church as you did, let's say, among the Mission Friends, where you have a figure like Eric August Skogsberg, who's known as the Swedish Moody. And he starts to build large tabernacles on the Moody auditorium style, which actually goes back to Finney in the 1820s, where the pulpit's in the center, everyone needs to see and hear that moment of evangelistic preaching is everything. Skogsberg had no difficulty raising money to build these buildings. He was even an amateur architect and would design them himself. So I think if you could take that entrepreneurial role within an ethnic community that draws people to it. I grew up in Skogsberg's church in Minneapolis, which was a big tabernacle-style building in 1886. That was a haven for Swedish immigrants to arrive. And because he was a popular preacher, regardless of what you thought about him, you could be drawn to that place because you'd hear the language, a lot of young people, you lived in boarding houses in the neighborhood, you could network for jobs, meet friends, make friends, find a mate, and off your life would go. And in some cases, you got converted along the way. That kind of entrepreneurial activity tended to work well in the United States. And its competitive nature, I think, created a problem everywhere. In the 19th century, a lot of groups would cooperate because their voluntary associations that were related to mission or religious activities, they found that they could transcend the particular denominational lines, let's say, and cooperate. But it didn't take very long, and that cooperation tended to fall away because of competition over money or the greater institutionalization of churches and movements. I think the entrepreneurial model was puzzling to those who had stronger ecclesial traditions where they were rooted in local parishes and traditional ways. Carl Olson, in his massive history of the Covenant Church in the early 1960s, made an interesting comment about the difference between an Augustana preacher and a covenant preacher. He said the Augustana preacher was always secure in the role of pastoral identity. You knew what it was you were supposed to do. You were educated for that purpose for the most part. And as Carl said in his own way, you could be a dreary preacher, a boring person, and do very well in ministry. Where the Covenant Church, because of this more entrepreneurial side to it. I mean, the Covenant Church had that strong Lutheran pastoral identity too, but it wasn't in everybody. you succeeded or failed in your preaching by how many responded. If you were a popular preacher. And those who were less talented had to get by with, well, they told jokes, or they postured in a certain way, trying to be like that kind of popular person. I think that's a very American kind of phenomenon in the 19th century. And again, I recommend Nathan Hatch's book on democratization, because he really looks at that carefully. One of the funny storytellers in the Covenant tradition, a guy named Adam Liedman, he always would get on people in his churches who went off running somewhere to hear the latest evangelist coming through. He said, "Why do you do that?" And they said, well, Pastor Liedman, you need to understand that we were converted under people like that. And Liedman said, well, so what? Peter was converted by the crowing of a cock. Do you think he spent the rest of his life chasing chickens? That's a good story. Yeah. The entrepreneurial works in American religion for a time. I don't know if that got at your question, John.
Any more questions?
I was really, can I?
Yes.
Someone else? I like the way you talked about humor as being revelatory of these differences, this competitive nature, and how you brought us back to this just this time. And one of the things that's I'm just sort of wrestling with, because humor is a very male-centered rhetorical activity, than anything that might have been remembered or passed on. So I'm so intrigued by it, but I'm wondering how it would be useful to reveal the experience of women or children or something in this. How would they respond to that? And I remember my father will tell jokes sometimes that he remembered that his father used to tell. And one was about, and he said, women were always the butt of his father's jokes. And the one that I can remember right now was about an old woman who's looking at a cemetery, and she says, "Här kommer vi alla om vi får hälsa och får leva så länge." And you know, there's that kind of what is that about? That's about women. But it's, I'm wondering if there's a way we could retrieve some of these old stories things. Oh, I should translate it. It means, she says, she's looking at the tombstone, she said, "Oh, here we'll all come if we have health and get to live that long." So I can kind of visualize it, and it's, I'm just wondering if any of the stories that you remember of this humor did poke fun at the women or do something that would be helping us to see the continuities between the different types of churches. And I guess also it might go towards the whole question of compulsion versus this freedom, because what you're doing is you're putting this kind of sense of fatalism is being teased at in that story too.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. I think the nature of the source, and that it is largely an oral tradition, a lot of it came from pastors. They were the stories that they told about each other, or the experiences they had. They turned it into humor. There's actually a very fine book on early humor in the Covenant Church, and unfortunately it has the title "The Wit and Wisdom of Our Fathers." And it's loaded with great stories because it captures the oral tradition. And but I can't think of too many that really involve, you know, women or children. It wasn't the nature. You know, they weren't Ole and Lena type stories. And so I think there's a limit to what you can do with that in terms of how it reveals the nature of communities.
Bill, do you think Augustana, the Synod, ever solved the tension that existed in it during its life between its sense of heritage as a, they prefer to say folk rather than state church, but it's heritage as a organization that was either coercively or compulsorily set up and supported. And the reality of its life as a free church in North America. Do you think that tension stayed with them for their 102 years, or did they?
Yeah, I mean, many of you know far more about Augustana than I do. You've written books about it. But,
well, I don't know. But
Yeah.
I'm not fishing for the right answer because I didn't make it. I don't know what to think.
yeah. I think the history and the heritage, perhaps, was a rooted way in thinking about what kind of church are we in America. And it gets perhaps to that distinction between whatever it is a folk church means.
Mm-hmm.
And I know Bergendorf liked that,
Oh, yeah, I love it.
and Soderblom talked about it that
Oh, yeah.
way, because it gets away from the state church language. And as a distinction from, say, a believer's church model, where ostensibly it's an inclusive congregation of everyone, children, everyone.
Mm-hmm.
But that matter of formal membership and belonging requires an experience about which you can speak and which is recognized by others, and then you become a member. So there's no such thing, let's say, as being a baptized member. And whether it was in the past or in the present, for those who think about the nature of the church, this relationship of believing and belonging is every bit as real. And I think the Lutheran churches represent a very clear and coherent understanding of the nature of believing and belonging. And challenged perhaps today by more and more in our culture of belonging is one way to get to believing. I mean, the ELCA right now is having a discussion about, do you commune individuals who have not been baptized? I mean, that's going to be a lively, I would imagine, discussion about believing and belonging.
Yeah.
And I think what Naival was trying to do with his two minds, in that it's not an either or, is that regardless of what your understanding of belonging in the church may be, the necessity of that element, which is subjective, at some point in your life requires your own volition and choosing, is important. And that may have been Bergendorf's dilemma, because he understood that part of it. But in the case of some of these Swedish Americans, like the Covenant, they said, well, we don't need the Oxford Confession to be able to think correctly about all these matters theologically. So my own impression is that a church like Augustana solved this in its own way, and as time went by, more in relation with the Lutheran world,
Right.
globally and in the United States, than ever with the diverging paths of the Swedish American free denominations.
Mm-hmm.
And probably in reality became a pretty congregational church in terms of polity at the local level and how decisions get made at annual conferences. Now, that's not my tradition, so I can't speak to it as directly as some of the rest of you. But it became American in that way, and had to finance and compete for resources and figure out how to do mission, just like everybody else, regardless of what your ecclesiology was.
I grew up in a good Augustana environment, and I think there's always that tension between the free movement and the church-state movement. Between which is a head knowledge and soul knowledge. There was, back in the 1920s, there was one of the pastors here from, I think one of the first pastors that was one of the churches felt the need to start Lutheran Bible Institute movement. And there was that tension between the head knowledge and the heart knowledge, and the ones that subscribed to that free movement thought that there was something lacking that came from the, Augustana College and so forth, that they needed to be more spiritual and be more biblical orientated and so forth. And I think there was always that tension.
Yeah, and that's a tension within for Swedish American Lutherans or Norwegian American Lutherans. They had to deal with the Hauge strands of piety and the free Norwegian Lutherans. In one way or another, all of these internal tensions historically had to do with the role of pietism in their earlier histories of awakening, of popular renewal that never was strictly religious. It was always social and economic and political. It's very intertwined. So those were tensions within. And so if you write about the history of Augustana, you write about the Lutheran Bible Institute and other kinds of things, which is its story. And the Norwegians can do the same thing.
Time is passing quickly when you are learning something. I may have one last question, if I may. Your argument here revolves around the democratization of the churches. You quoted Tocqueville, who talks about the more democratic church in America. And Sävström and others have the argument about Sweden, that the free church movement and the popular movements in general lead to democratization of Swedish society and opening up. If you can take your own spiritual destiny in your own hands, you don't need a minister in a state church, what is it that says that you can't take your own political future in your own hands? I mean, you're politically mature also, and that leads to democratization. That's an hypothesis about developments in Sweden. But what I'm interested in, and you see that in America too, a democratic movements, if you call it, in the churches. However, the two countries diverge in an interesting way, in that Sweden goes towards secularism, but the United States does not. When I teach American studies at home at Uppsala, one of the big differences that students observe is, of course, the high degree of religiosity in American society. The fact that when our former Prime Minister in the election campaign of 2008 was asked the question, do you believe in God? He said, no. Okay, next question, how about tax cuts? No, I haven't really. Okay. In America, if a presidential candidate had been asked the question, do you believe in God? No. That would not have been, okay, next question. It was, oh my God, what is going on, So the role there's a common thread here of the kind of the democratization, that the various religious forces lead to democratization of societies. It's an argument, and that's transferred perhaps from the United States to Sweden. But then you get outcomes that are widely different. Sweden may be one of the more secular countries of the world. Perhaps Societies Without God, isn't that the title of that book? Denmark is #1 and Sweden is #2. But the United States is not a society without God. And how do we think about those, larger forces there? Democratization does not lead to secularization in the United States, but it does in Sweden, perhaps. It could be an hypothesis. I don't know if you have any comments. It's a huge topic.
Well, it is. I know that Stephen Warner, who's a sociologist of religion at University of Illinois, Chicago, has said in a variety of ways that the religiosity of the American experience is directly related to competition and pluralism, and the fact that it is always being fed anew by recent immigrants, different kinds of experiences, and that competition in its history has bred a kind of cultural religiosity, even if it's not arguably borne out by what you actually do or if you go to church. And all those numbers are greatly exaggerated because they're based on self-reporting. I think if a political candidate here was asked, do you believe in God, that's not a sufficient question. They need to know a lot more information about you, and they won't let it go. And you can say something very honestly, and they won't believe you. I am a Christian. No, you're a Muslim. I know you are. Well, does this make any sense at all? Well, in America, it does, and it can actually lead to a word like evangelical becoming a political identifying mark, and has had a key role in a few elections now. I can't see that happening. I mean, in a European or Scandinavian, getting the evangelical vote, which is a religious word. I think the historic separation of church and state has caused Americans to act out their ideologies in a variety of ways. So in the late 1970s, the emergence of the new right, moral majority, religious roundtable, Christian coalition, this unusual marriage between political conservatives and religious conservatives who really didn't want anything to do with the state before. And all of a sudden now they find a marriage by which, through mass mailings and all the rest, you can affect the course of the political outcomes because you're unified about this issue or that issue, and you can cluster them all together. I don't think that's new in American politics, and I mean, that was Tocqueville's comment. Why does a preacher sound like a politician?
Yeah.
There was a Pew study, foundation study, that came out last week that says that despite the historic separation of church and state, the majority of Americans now want a stronger role of religion in American political life. But what do they mean by that? For some it means, I need my pastor to tell me every Sunday what I should think about this issue or that issue. If because of social media we now tend to cluster with people who think like us anyway, then you want to sit there and listen to a religious justification for a political view that you may have and how you should vote. And so, I mean, this is so puzzling when these studies take place. So the relationship between the religious and the political is always there, and that's not going to go away. It really isn't.
And we certainly have two very different developments in these two countries that we've been talking about. Sometimes the term American exceptionalism is used and abused, but perhaps there's also Swedish exceptionalism. That could be a topic for another conference. Swedish and American exceptionalism. If you are interested in Swedish exceptionalism, I encourage you to visit the World Values Survey homepage. It's a huge sociological study that tries to measure values in different countries and what people think about different matters. And they run numbers. It's hugely quantitative. But the conclusion is that when it comes to certain values, Sweden systematically is an outlier. Sweden, it's on the upper right corner of these four people. You know, Sweden is very different from most other countries. Sweden is strange. And the United States is here somewhere in the middle. Sweden is up there.
And how is that strange? In what way?
An example.
Well, I mean, what they measure is, on one axis is wow.
No, just quick set of describers.
No, but it has to do with religiosity, for example.
Okay.
Secularism, religiosity, and it has to do with, in some sense, collective versus individual.
Yeah.
And that's what it can be boiled down to. And
Sure.
Sweden systematically appears in the upper right corner. So that's a deviation, exception from the norm in the middle, where the US sometimes is. Some people say that if you're up there in the upper right corner, that's also the way of the future. That's modernization or the development. So the way Sweden goes, the world will go. So we're not talking about the Americanization of the world, but the Swedishization of the world. The Germans said the Schwedishisering der Welt is the... But World Values Survey suggests, I mean, it's an interesting, it's called the Cultural Atlas of the World, where they try to group countries together. And religion has a great deal to do with these differences, I would argue. And so it sets the two countries apart. from this common background that you spoke of, and the specific developments and the cultural context that they encounter, makes it that's why many Swedes come here, they're puzzled by the religiosity. And when many Swedish Americans go to Sweden, they're puzzled by the lack of religiosity. When we had our summer program in Grevenstad, it was next to the church, the school. And many of the students went to church on Sundays, and they came back. Some a bit upset, there was no one there. What's going on? We had come back to the Lutheran homeland. There was no one there. Okay, thank you, Phil, so much.